Hey guys, welcome to the podcast today. And I've got a fantastic guest for you today, Kevin Palmieri. He's been through it all. He's going to talk about his journey. He's a fantastic guest talking about business entrepreneurship coming out of Massachusetts. I'm really happy to have Kevin on. Welcome, Kevin.
Dr. Chris, I appreciate you having me on. I'm excited to chat and see where our conversation takes us.
Yeah, I love that. And we keep it informal here. So just call me Chris. And
Done.
yeah, just introduce yourself, what you do. And I'm excited to dive into the questions.
Yeah, so I am Kevin Palmieri. I am the founder and the host of Next Level University, a global top 100 podcast with, I think, 1,830 episodes as of today, over 1 million listens, and it is my full-time job now. I am a full-time, quote-unquote, professional podcaster, but obviously that is not where I started. The journey has been long, and there's been a lot of growth in the journey.
Interesting. Yeah, because I want to ask you later on why you chose to focus on podcasting.
Of course.
And what's interesting is you had all this success, and I see this very commonly. All these entrepreneurs, they have 7, 8-figure, 9-figure, whatever type of success, and you were still very unhappy and unfulfilled. So what was the turning point that set you on the path to discovering your purpose?
Yeah, I was somebody who never really expected to be any level of successful. And here I was in my mid-20s with a 6-figure job. My girlfriend at the time was a model. I was in the best shape of my life because I was getting ready to compete in a bodybuilding show. I had all the things: health, wealth, life, and love. It looked like I had them all. But my mental health was really hurting me at the time, and I wasn't confident, and I had no self-worth. And my girlfriend left me, and I made more money, and then I ended up sitting on the edge of a bed contemplating suicide a couple of years later. And that was the turning point for me where I said, okay, I've accomplished a lot of the external stuff, but I think I'm trying to accomplish the external stuff because I'm probably trying to cover up a void of internal stuff that I'm not ready to face yet. I fell in love with awareness. I fell in love with learning about myself. So in 2017, I started a podcast that was all about self-awareness. And that began the journey of trying to learn as much about myself as humanly possible. So it was mostly massive pain that took me from my old life to my new life. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of us go through that because pain is a really good necessity to make a change. And unfortunately, that is the way it went for me.
So one thing that really contemplated recently is you go on the Instagram and again, they have this picture perfect lifestyle. And why is there a dichotomy? Is it just basically for show and basically overcompensating, or what's going on? What's going on there?
I think a piece of it is marketing. If I am a podcaster and I'm podcasting in a box, you're probably not going to think I'm a very good podcaster. So I think that's one piece of it is just perception. I think a lot of people are just using it as perception. The other piece of it is a lot of people have built up a reputation and they're terrified to lose that reputation. And everybody thinks that is what we all aspire for. But you use the word when you ask the question, you said fulfillment. I think fulfillment is really hard to recognize. And what we think is happiness is really easy to recognize. Fast car, big house, whatever. We think that's happiness. But there's a big difference between happiness and fulfillment. Yeah, I think it's just people want to keep their pecking order in society. And one of the ways to be high in society is to look like you're crushing it more than everybody else. But that is not the whole picture. Honestly, I don't even think it's half the picture at this point.
Yeah. I spent the summer living abroad in South America. And what's interesting is they're more insulated against what you're describing as the symbolism of capitalism and just that. And sometimes sometimes in the culture. The next question I have for you is why did you choose podcasting? Why not YouTube, or why not be a keynote or Instagram? What was it about podcasting that really made you fulfilled?
Joe Rogan got me into it. I think Joe Rogan has gotten more people into podcasting than maybe anybody else. And it was the sexy thing in 2017. It was this sexy allure of doing something that nobody I knew was doing. I was actually interviewed on a YouTube channel. And when I was done with that interview, I said to one of my friends, I said, imagine if you could do that for a living. It wasn't the YouTube thing. It was just talking into a mic and having the opportunity to impact people in a positive way. So I learned about podcasting from Joe Rogan. I was interviewed on a YouTube channel. I loved it. The process was fulfilling. I was in flow. And then I imagined a world where I could do that full time. And I just fell in love with it. And then eventually it all made sense because one of our mentors said, if you go all in, you pick one thing, you go all in on that one thing, eventually you can do all the others. So if you go all in on podcasting, yeah, eventually you'll grow an Instagram following, you'll get paid to speak, you'll get paid to do this, you'll be able to travel. And that's been the thing. 80% of our time, energy, and effort goes into the podcast, but I've gotten paid speaking opportunities and a lot of amazing benefits that have come from it. So yeah, podcasting is the thing. It is the train that keeps everything else rolling for us.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because they like basically the other guest the other day, she was talking about how all these independent creators now we don't need the gatekeepers, we don't need NBC to tell us what to put out. And what's interesting is what from a influencer standpoint, you sounds like going from, because I was doing a lot of coaching and trading my time in keynotes and then the world shut down. And so I started the podcast and I was hoping that was just a hobby and it took off before the world opened up. So what key mindset shifts did you make to build your podcast? And it sounds like you're really doing a really significant business revenue.
I appreciate it. One of the things is, especially in the beginning, it's what you just talked about, but in a different way. If you want to grow, you have to scale the unscalable in the beginning. So one of the things and one of the key mindset shifts for me was you have to treat every single listener like they're the only listener, because the best way to grow a podcast is word of mouth. And the best way to get word of mouth is to create an experience with someone that they just didn't expect, and they want to share that experience with other people. That was one. The second thing was I really had to pivot from a very short time perspective to a longer time perspective, because I thought things were going to happen right away. I thought you get a big guest, you blow up, you go viral, and then everything works. That is not the case. It's more about the small incremental shifts of, if I listen to this episode and me speaking, and I go back and listen to an episode from 5 years ago, I will be drastically better today than I was 5 years ago. But if I listen to the episodes I recorded yesterday, Chris, I am no better. I probably am worse, depending on how much sleep I got. So one of the shifts was understanding that from day to day, progress is invisible. It ceases to exist. But week to week, month to month, year to year, progress is impossible to miss because it's compounding and compounding. That was a really big thing for me. And then just getting used to seeing my face on camera every day. That was a mindset and a physical shift. It's just something that I didn't know I was ever going to get used to. But at this point, I'm all over the internet, which is very strange. But now I'm just used to it. It's normal now.
Yeah. You mentioned discoverability and what it sounds like, because I know, for example, when blogs were out, it was like SEO. And then when YouTube is still SEO. So what is the best way to get your podcast found? Is there such thing as podcast SEO or advertising or?
Yeah, there's advertising. You can do paid ads, and you can, depending on what host you use, you can pay to get your podcast as an ad on somebody else's podcast. Does that work? Yeah. I think the best way is to build a community. It's a different conversation between keeping an audience and growing an audience. Those are two very different conversations. And a lot of people are focused on how do I get as many listeners as possible, not how do I retain as many listeners as possible. Right now, there's a big push, and the data is showing that YouTube is one of the best ways to get found for your podcast. So being on YouTube, making sure that you're using keywords, making sure you're using tags, making sure you have good thumbnails, high quality video, all of that stuff is one great way to get found. The second one is always going to be referrals. That is the number 2 way. It's probably going to stay the number 2 way. And then social media. If one of the most common things I see is people start a podcast and then they just make their social media entirely about the podcast. Probably not the best idea, because you want to try to grow the social media channel and then introduce the new people to the podcast, and eventually they may transition over. Those are the top 3 ways. Being on other podcasts is always a great way. Speaking is a great way. Newsletters. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. It's just I think the best understanding I have is it's probably going to take longer than you think. It's not a you issue. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. that is just the state of podcasting in 2024.
Yeah, I love that. And so next thing that's really interesting is I've heard that the listenership, like the people craving for podcast content is increasing. And that's why I started in 2018, just because I wanted to get in the ground floor, that capture attention. But then the number of podcasters, like actually creating content, pod fade it's actually the number of podcasts like active are just dwindling. How do you avoid pod fade and how do you stay consistent? That's one of the big themes, and what daily habits practices have been key to your transformation.
Yeah. So the thing that helped us in the beginning with pod fade is we had the discipline and the design. One of the reasons people call it quits early is because if you're 3 episodes in and you have to set up your studio, you have to fix your lights, and you have to find your mic, and you have to make sure the kids are out of the house, whatever it is, understandably, circumstantially, then it's harder to do. So you have to create as much ease as possible. You have to limit the amount of resistance you have. That's one thing. I think the other one is it's really hard to have misaligned expectations. If you think 5 episodes in, you're going to be on the top charts, statistically, you're most likely wrong. I was too. I'm not making you wrong for that. But it's that. I think our expectations hold us back because we say, if I'm not there in 5 episodes, I'm going to call it quits. So much of it has to do with the why power, Chris. Why did you start in the first place? Did you start to impact people? Cool. You can do that in episode 1. If you have 5 people that listen, you impacted 5 people. But if you started to make a boatload of money, you're probably looking at 3 to 5 years minimum before that boat arrives in the port. So it's understandable why a lot of people call it quits. For me, this is literally a dream come true. The fact that I get to do this, I don't have a job, this is my career, I have a business, that is just mind-blowing to me. So I never really experienced the pod fade because it wasn't about me, it was about the audience, it was about impact. The habits for me are, number 1, learning. If I'm not learning every day, it's going to be really hard for me to be a good podcast host. I have to practice my craft. I have to learn more. I speak every day, whether it's on my social media or on a podcast or whatever it is. So speaking every day is super important for me. Learning every day is super important for me. Exercise is really important because that's how I get centered. So just like any other entrepreneur or business owner, I try to take care of myself first. I take care of my family. And then I'm making sure that I'm growing the business and doing all the things necessary in the business to make sure we're thriving.
Yeah, I love that. And I had another podcaster as well, full time. And he was saying in the beginning, he was just, his MO was just, he wanted to learn, just make it better and efficient. And then it was just more just like you said, practicing in your craft and getting better and better. And a lot of podcasters, they're going to software and just making the process a lot faster and easier and just getting it out there. There's like the indie podcasters and there's the big podcast shops such as yourself, where there's another podcaster that helps creators design studios. Do you need a podcast studio? At what point do you start to consider making a spare bedroom a studio or whatnot?
I think a lot of it is just preference. I have always wanted a studio. It was like a dream for me to have my own space.
Yeah.
But I work with many podcasters who are making meaningful dollars from their podcasts and they're on the top of the charts and they don't have a studio. They have a spare room, but it's not a studio by any stretch of the imagination. So I think it depends. I think it depends on how much of your time do you want to put into it? How big of a piece of your business is it? If the podcast dies, Chris, everything dies, right? The podcast is what leads to so many other amazing opportunities for us. So a lot of time, energy, effort, focus, and dollars has gone into making the podcast as good as possible. It's not a requirement. Will it help you? Probably a little bit on social media. Will it help you if you're trying to get clients? Probably. But it is by no means a requirement. But I think if it's a goal for you, start small. This studio you're seeing is 7 years in the making. Mm-hmm. Our very first studio, and this is in quotations for anybody listening, was my business partner's mom's basement. That was our second studio, technically.
Yeah.
We were in a basement for a while. So it was good to have our own space. And at that time, we were pumped about it. So not a requirement, but if it's a goal, good for you and keep chasing it for sure.
Yeah. I really love that. And just like I love this idea from the Apple story from garage to big company. Where are we in terms of the adoption trend? For example, because like you can like when you compare like TV, radio, and you compare like social media and you compare to YouTube, where is podcasting in the growth trend compared to these other avenues and platforms?
Yeah, I believe 2024 is the first year where we have actually crossed into the majority of the population knowing about podcasts and actually listening. So I believe the stat is in the last 30 days, hypothetically, 51% of the population, and this is in the US, has listened to a podcast actively. It's growing very steadily. Not One of the interesting things about the pandemic is it really skewed the data.
Mm-hmm.
There was a ton of people that started podcasts during the pandemic, and there was a ton of people that were listening to podcasts during the pandemic. And as we came back to normal life, a lot of those podcasts died off, and a lot of those podcast listeners died off as well. So I don't know how it's growing in terms of, in comparison to social media and YouTube and that, but I do know that we have crossed the threshold of the majority of people actually knowing and consuming podcasts, which is the first time ever that is. So it is not too late. It is not too saturated. There are a lot of people out there looking for high quality content. If you can produce it, the cream always rises to the top eventually.
Yeah, I love that. So shifting gears and towards the more of the end of the conversation, I know you founded Next Level University. What is it? How can people find out more about it? What's next? And what new projects or initiatives are you excited about in the near future?
Next Level University is our podcast that's all about leveling up your life, your love, your health, and your wealth. I didn't want to be somebody who was in really good shape but broke. I didn't want to be broke but deeply in love. I wanted to find a way to get it all because I've had bouts of each throughout life, and I was never fulfilled when I only had one, Chris. It always sucked. I was looking for something else. So that's our podcast, and that's what we talk about every single day. That's on all the podcast platforms. We're on YouTube. The other thing that I do that might be beneficial to your audience, if you are a podcaster and you're listening, I have a podcast called Podcast Growth University, where every week I do an episode on growing and scaling and making money with your podcast. So if you're somebody who's looking to do, that's a free resource as well. What's next? Probably the unsexy answer of just trying to get a little bit better at everything that we do. I don't really have anything. Q4 is coming up. So we're going to look to crush it in Q4 and get better and add more value and give more impact. And what are we working on? We have something that is near and dear to our heart that we've been leaning into a lot more. We have a charity called the Next Level Hope Foundation. And it is for children of single parents because my business partner and I were both raised by single parents. So we do a holiday event as well as a Father's Day event every year. And to have a good time with kids who might have negative times around those dates.
Yeah. And, for the audience out there that are listening and they struggle with mental health or emotional and, or they struggle with overcoming or they struggle with imposter syndrome, limiting beliefs, low confidence, low self-worth, what inspirational advice do you have for them to get them started on their journey?
One of the things is you are way more malleable than you probably understand. You probably didn't think you could drive a car before you drove a car, and now you do it without thinking about it. You probably didn't think you could start a business, and you most likely have a business that's doing really well. Most of the things that you are doing right now that you make look easy probably seemed impossible at some point in the journey, but you started small. Something happens when we cross a certain age where it almost seems embarrassing to start small, but that is the way to build belief. That is the way to work through imposter syndrome. And honestly, that is the way to get results. You start small, you get your feet wet, and then as you get more comfortable, things evolve and you get better. Chris, I'm sure you're way better as a podcaster now than you were when you first started. That's just the way it works, but you kept going. And that is the reason you are better today than you were in the beginning. So yeah, don't ever be afraid to start small. Starting small is better than not starting at all.
Yeah. Yeah, you should have seen some of my earlier videos.
Same, Chris. Same. That's why I know.
I could just laugh and just, it's just, they were horrible. But yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation. And for the audience, be sure to follow Kevin's channel. All of his resources will be links in the show notes. And thanks so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise, Chris. I appreciate you. Thank you for having me.